So, big news with the American legal system, and that is that the state of Virginia has announced that it is abolishing the death penalty. This is pretty significant because Virginia has carried out the most executions ever throughout its history, and in recent years, the most after the state of Texas. Obviously, it in statehood before Texas, so that explains the more executions there. I think it's over 1,600 in Virginian history. Um, so this big news, and there's a lot of talking points around it. Vox reports one of the death penalty's former strongholds will abolish it. The reports by Ian Milheiser. Virginia used to execute more people than any other state than Texas, apart from Texas. Now it's abolishing executions. Um, The Commonwealth of Virginia executed more people in the last 45 years than any state other than Texas. Um, After the Supreme Court established a modern legal framework governing death sentences in Gregg versus Georgia in 1976, Gary Gilmore, of course, was executed in the state of Utah, I believe, in January 77. That was the first execution in the United States since 1963. It's sometimes easy to forget that there was a whole 14-year period in the United States where there were no executions in the Johnson and Nixon and early Ford years. So that's interesting. But Virginia hasn't executed anyone since 2017 and will soon abolish this altogether under Governor Ralph Northam. Now, the reason citing for this is the prevalence of black condemned, those who are poor, and those who are mentally impaired. One big problem I think in the American legal system is money, access to lawyers. So a defendant that has more money is going to get a better lawyer. That's something that really needs to be looked at because there have been many high-profile cases where there has been a last-minute reprieve or not a last-minute reprieve. That's very significant. Virginia's decision to halt executions is possible because of the demographic changes that have transformed the one-time Republican stronghold into an increasingly reliable blue state. Northern Virginia has long provided homes to much of Washington, D.C.'s cosmopolitan workforce, but this region has grown more diverse and more democratic in recent years, especially in D.C.'s former conservative exurbs. Of course, D.C. exurbs and suburbs go outside the city jurisdiction. Meanwhile, Richmond, Virginia's low rents, mild climate make it an attractive place for young professionals to move, and these professionals often bring liberal views that have transformed the politics of the former capital of the Confederacy. The result is that Northam is the first Democratic governor of the state to serve alongside a Democratic state legislature since former Governor Douglas Wilder, who left office in 1994. And Wilder led the state at a time when Southern Democrats were often quite conservative. With unified Democratic control of its elective branches, Virginia expanded Medicaid. It also recently enacted laws barring LGBTQ discrimination, rolling back restrictions on abortion, regulating guns, and expanding voting rights. In other words, Virginia's become more liberal in recent years. That sort of situation matters because a lot of this is divided along red and blue lines. Generally speaking, Democrats are anti-death penalty, Republicans are pro-death penalty. Of course, it's not that simple. There will be conservative Democrats who support it. Bill Clinton, infamously, when he was running for president, rushed back to Arkansas as governor, as he was still technically governor at that point, to order an execution or to approve an execution just to show he was tough on crime, which, in my thinking, is one of the most cynical things Clinton done in his public life. Um, if that was as a matter of conviction, it's one thing, but just to show he was tough on crime, I think that's pretty awful. Okay, so I come from a country where we've had the death penalty gone since 1964. That's when our less executions were simultaneously at Liverpool and Manchester prisons. It was formally abolished in the mainland in 1968. It was actually on the statute books as late as the early 1990s, but it was never going to be carried out. I think there was not a soldier. I think there was an IRA fighter convicted in Northern Ireland of murdering a soldier, and or it was something like that. I forget precise details. But the point is, we haven't had an execution since 1964. It wasn't marked at the time because it was still in statute, and so there was a notion that there may be more executions, but that never happened. 1964. Most countries that abolish the death penalty don't go back. In the United States, there was Furman versus the state of Georgia. That was a rare example where a country had the death penalty, abolished it, and then it went back. Um, so let me just get that right. Greg versus the state of Georgia, 1976. Interestingly, that was reintroduced under the Carter presidency, which is interesting because Carter's one of the more left-wing presidents. But in the case of the United States, I do think there are very serious problems in their legal system. Now, the United States, the number of executions have gradually been dropping year on year. In recent years, it's averaged about 20 executions a year. Of course, there was a spate of federal executions in Trump's last months in office, including controversial ones. And I think, again, Trump was doing what Clinton done. He wanted to show he was tough. Um, Trump had more federal executions than any president since, I think, Harry Truman. Um, so that's important to look at what the trajectory is. If you look at the 1990s, I think I'm right in saying more people were executed under the Clinton presidency or the Bush 43 presidency, one of those two, than any other president in the modern era. Um, but that has declined in recent years. Over the 2000s and the 2010s, the number of annual executions were gradually being decreased. California put it on hold, and I don't think California's carried out an execution since 2006. Stanley Tookie Williams was a high-profile case there. Um, this is a subject that is often featured in popular culture. The film The Life of David Gale is an interesting look, very much from the anti-side. Um, Dead Man Walking about the nun, Jean Pridgeon. She, of course, has welcomed this decision. I imagine groups like Amnesty International will strongly welcome it. Here's the thing. I've always been uneasy with the death penalty because I think the mistakes are irreversible. There was a case in China where a young guy was executed for rape, and 21 years later, it was ruled that he was innocent, and the court gave his family compensation, but obviously that would never make up for what happened. That's the point about the death penalty. Mistakes cannot be remedied. The difference with someone being in prison is if they are found innocent, at least they can be released. It's still a terrible thing. A miscarriage of justice is always a terrible thing, but at least there could be some chance of them getting back to life. If someone's dead, that isn't possible. Um, Dennis Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher's spouse, made an interesting point. They disagreed on that. She was for the death penalty, he was against it. He was against it, though, for an interesting reason. He pointed out that in the jury system, a jury might actually find someone innocent because they would be worried about hanging an innocent man. So, ironically, you would actually, with the death penalty in place, a jury might actually find a guilty person innocent simply because of the fear that they could be sending an innocent person to the gallows, as it would be in this country. So, ironically, in that sense, public fear about executing an innocent person with the death penalty in place could lead to guilty people getting off the hook. That was an interesting way to look at it. Um, but in more broader terms, just the mistakes that could be made is really something that should concern anyone. Having said that, what the anti death penalty advocates really, really need to accept is that, and it was a high profile case, actually, one of the federal executions Trump carried out. I think it was the penultimate one. I forget her name off the top of my head, but the woman who drove across several states under the false guise that she was going to be involved in the purchase of a puppy, and she brutally murdered a young pregnant woman. That really, really scarred that community, and there was very strong feelings over that case. Now, her own sister said that she should have served uh, life without parole. Um, I had mixed feelings about that. I think the mental health argument, I'm not sure how much say that weighs up when at the time of the crime she had this, you know, the ability to drive hundreds of miles. I find it hard to believe that she didn't know what she was doing in that context. But anyway, this is a big move for the abolitionist faction. So now I think 23 American states have abolished this completely. Most of the others have it on statute, or they have it, but they haven't carried out an execution for years. So I think as it stands, it's only Texas, Florida, Oklahoma, I think Nevada or Nebraska. And certainly most of those executions are in the state of Texas. If it's ever completely abolished in the United States, which presumably would be have to be at federal level, that would be a tough push. Biden suggested that he wants to do it. If it didn't go at the federal level and it just gradually kind of went away, it would absolutely be Texas that would be the last to hold out. I think Texans are very conservative in that sense, and I think it would be a real battle in Texas. But if the demographics change in Texas, it could be a similar situation to Virginia. Who knows? I do think that's far down the line, probably 1 or 2 decades from now. Um, Here's the thing, though: the anti-death penalty people need to accept. They need to accept that the most evil, damaging, destructive crimes. I find sometimes they lose public support because they don't sufficiently indicate that they are not against justice, that they believe that the most heinous criminals should be punished. So sometimes I think a mistake that the anti-death penalty lobby has made in the United States is not sufficiently showing that they do sympathise with victims of crime and that they do believe that victims of crime deserve justice. And there are some crimes that are so evil and so heinous that I personally think that you know death is probably too good for the criminal. You know, raping and murdering a child, for example, don't get much worse than that. So for me, it's not sympathy with the criminal in that sort of situation. It's more about what do you normalize and what is legal and what isn't. This is a complex subject, and ultimately, I think the death penalty is state-sanctioned killing. That's ultimately what it is, whatever way you gloss it over. And the basic argument will kill someone to show that killing is wrong, is flawed. I'm a conservative on crime. I believe that the worst criminals should never be released. I believe some people cannot be rehabilitated. That's where I would strongly differ from liberals who believe that, oh, we can fix everyone. I don't think so. Someone who, even depressing to talk about it, but you know what I mean, the worst of the worst, I don't think you can rehabilitate. But the death penalty, you know, the United States and Japan are the only two developed democracies that still use it. In Japan, it's a case of they're not even told when their death date will be. It's literally a knock on the door and it happens that day. I think the Japanese system definitely lacks transparency, and that's a big problem. It's something they need to address. And countries like China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, you know, the numbers go into the hundreds and thousands, far, far higher than the United States. And in the case of China, it's long been believed that the organs of prisoners are, part of the organ harvesting industry. The CCP denies this, of course, but I would point out that Falun Gong practitioners are among the regular criminals. Um, so there's a very, very murky world with the Chinese death penalty. And, it's on a very large scale. We're talking thousands of people. Iran, hundreds of people. And they will do things like execute gay men on the guise that they're drug dealers. So pretty much every country that uses it, there are serious flaws in the system. Does that mean that I sympathise with the worst criminals? Absolutely not. And this is another problem with the death penalty. It puts us a motive angle on it in the eyes of its supporters in countries that have it. If you don't agree with it, then you're sympathetic to criminals. That's not true. In fact, some would even say that they're against it because it's too much of an easy way out for the worst criminals. If you get a child killer, and they are given lethal injection, that's relatively quick and painless. Some would say, why should they get the easy way out? Would it not be better to make them suffer for the rest of their days in prison? If it's really about, making them pay for what they've done. So there's a lot of questions around this. Personally, I've always been uneasy with it because of the many, many flaws in the American system and because of the flaws in systems around the world. Wherever there is a death penalty, if you scrutinize it, there is problems. And the difference with that in countries that don't have it is in countries that don't have it, at least there's a chance of the system being fixed. At least there is a chance of reversal. You don't get that with the death penalty. You can't say, oh, well, we're very sorry we executed an innocent person because they can't be brought back. You could give money to their family, but that's at least if someone's been jailed for something they haven't done. It's a terrible, terrible thing. But that shows that, I mean, in America, there's been people who have been on death row. Evidence later emerged that was ignored at an initial trial. They were exonerated. And, at the time, people were clamoring for their blood, and yet they were innocent. So that's why people really, really need to think about the issues on this, in my opinion.